Borussia Dortmund have been in terrible form this season. For every good thing they do, like beating Celtic 7-1 or RB Leipzig 2-1, they then follow it up by losing to Mainz, or most recently VfL Bochum, who were dead last in the table before they played. Dortmund are stuck in mid-table right now, sitting in 11th place with about half the points of top-of-the-table Bayern. Remember, this team made it to the Champions League final last season, but now they're a point below Werder Bremen with a goal difference of -1. So what is happening to Dortmund? Well, I'm here to answer that question. In this video, I will explain to you why Dortmund are doing so badly right now, from off-the-pitch reasons to on-the-pitch reasons. I'll also be comparing them to the Dortmund teams of the past, and looking at what the future might hold. First of all, let's look at some of their results to truly emphasize how bad their form has been. I already mentioned the losses to Mainz and Bochum, but they also lost 4-2 to Holstein Kiel, who are bottom right now, Augsburg, and Union Berlin. And against the teams they should be competing against in and around the top 4, they've not been putting up a good enough fight. They lost to Frankfurt, Leverkusen, and Stuttgart, so yeah, not great in the Bundesliga to say the least. However, in the Champions League, it's been a different story. They've finished in 10th place, just a point off the top 8 with 5 wins and 3 losses. One of the losses against Bologna, which isn't great, but the other 2 are completely understandable losses to Real Madrid and Barcelona. Plus, they've just beaten Sporting in the playoff round first leg 3-0, and by the time this has been uploaded, they'll have probably made it through to the round of 16, although if I had to bet on one team to bottle a 3-0 lead in the first leg, it'd be Dortmund. But basically, this season it's been a tale of 2 Dortmunds. Dortmund in the league look much worse than Dortmund in the Champions League, which is kind of how last season went too. Dortmund went all the way to the Champions League final, of course, but finished just 5th in the Bundesliga, 27 points behind the winners Leverkusen. That was seen as very disappointing, but at this point, Dortmund fans wish they were in 5th place. For perspective, after matchday 22 last season, they were in 4th place on 41 points, 12 points more than they have right now. So yeah, they definitely have declined since last season. But now let's get into the why. I've got 3 main categories here: coaching, the board, and Dortmund's DNA. As for coaches, a big reason for their drop-off is the loss of their coach last year, Terzic, who before he became permanent manager was a longtime assistant for Lucien Favre, who I'd say is the best Dortmund coach since Klopp. Terzic had also previously worked for the team as a scout and a youth coach. I'll mention why that's relevant soon. Terzic wasn't tactically mind-blowing, but he brought a solid, more defensive-minded approach to Dortmund, which is really refreshing because they're usually the complete opposite, an amazing attack with a leaky defense. This more defensive mindset is really what helped them in the tense knockout ties in the Champions League last season, grinding out narrow victories. He also brought them seconds away from the Bundesliga title the season before that. So all in all, despite Dortmund failing to cross the line when it really mattered, Terzic was viewed as a solid coach for them. But I just mentioned that he was a longtime servant of the club, and that brings us to the board section of why Dortmund are underperforming. Many Dortmund fans feel like the board is making a lot of appointments simply because the candidate was a former Dortmund player or staff member. That's why Terzic was appointed, but the most prominent recent example of this is Nuri Sahin's disastrous stint as the manager for the first part of the season. It very much reads like the board didn't really have an identity in mind, so they just went for a former player that they knew. Now, this isn't a bad idea, and it's how so many coaches get hired already. Look at Arteta at Arsenal, look at Pep at Barcelona, and the best example of all, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer at Man United. But it starts to feel a bit like nepotism when it doesn't work out. Another example being that Sebastian Kehl was hired to replace legendary sporting director Michael Zorc. He hasn't exactly hit the ground running with his signings, and again, it really seems like he was just hired because of his ties to the club. Ralf Rangnick recently made a statement that I think rings very true. Under Klopp, it was clear that Zorc, the sporting director, Aki Watzke, the chairman, and the manager Jurgen Klopp were all working together with one identity. Now it really feels like the manager is completely separate from these kind of decisions, and there isn't a clear direction the club is moving in. Something else that's been interesting to me about Dortmund's board, especially in the past few years, is that while they are one of the most popular, successful teams in the world, they don't really make any high-profile signings. Now, in the past, this has worked absolute wonders for them, buying relatively unknown or cheap young players like Lewandowski, Aubameyang, Kagawa, Dembele, Sancho, Haaland, I could literally go on forever, and then selling these players for profit when they turn out to be amazing. But the problem is when you don't keep these stars and you sign more and more mediocre players to fill out the squad, You go from this to this. Now, of course, they do have the likes of Jamie Gittins, their typical wonder kid, as they always do, but other than a few standouts, this squad is the weakest Dortmund team we've had in a long, long time. Dortmund, for the most part, spend their money very cautiously. Too cautiously. And there's good reason for this. The club was this close to going bankrupt and being dissolved after being in over 100 million euros worth of debt in the early 2000s. Then Watzke came in, and it was his amazing investment and youth-oriented approach that had allowed them to climb back from that state. But now Dortmund have loftier ambitions. I'd compare them to a side like Atletico Madrid. They both made similar lower-profile signings of young players and sold them on for profit. They both reached a couple Champions League finals and couldn't win them. But now Atletico are making huge signings like the likes of Julian Alvarez, and you just don't see that from Dortmund. I know the Bundesliga does have stricter financial rules than many other leagues, but maybe if Dortmund did gamble a bit more and either strive to keep a huge star like a Bellingham or a Haaland, or invest some of the money from selling them in a real world-class player, they'd be doing much better. It's all well and good signing the likes of Maximilian Bayer, Marcel Sabitzer, or Ben Sebaini. They're good squad players, but if you want to push to the next level, you need game changers in there as well. Not to completely rain on Dortmund's parade, they still do make some great signings. For example, in recent times I'd call Gregor Kobel and Serhu Guirassy excellent transfers for the first team, but it's always sad when you see what Dortmund could have been. And with the present day's weaker squad, when you're scrambling to fit a manager into the system instead of letting the manager build their own team, it's pretty clear to see why Dortmund are slowly falling down the table. What I'd love to see from a Dortmund perspective is for them to go all in on a young manager and build the team around him, like they did with Klopp. For example, I say they should have gone all in on Fabian Hürzeler before Brighton got him. He's pretty much the most promising young managerial talent in the world. He's also German, so he's familiar with the league, and it would be so fitting for Dortmund to have a wonderkid manager with all their wonderkid players. But again, they didn't go for him, and they instead opted for Nuri Sahin, backing up my earlier point about nepotism, if you can call it that. But aside from their coach and their board decisions and the players they have in their squad, I think something just runs deeper inside Dortmund's DNA that's contributing to their failure right now. As someone who's been watching Dortmund for a long time, I haven't seen a more bipolar team. They have so much quality, but they can absolutely collapse on a whim. If you watch some of the goals they've given up, not just this year, but over the years, they make an uncharacteristic amount of defensive errors, slip-ups, chokes, whatever you want to call them. In the past couple weeks alone, 2 goals that they've conceded came from failed back passes. But these chokes aren't anything new. Dortmund are known for bottling. Perhaps the worst example being a couple years ago when all they had to do was beat Mainz on the final day in a packed stadium full of Dortmund fans at home waiting to see Reus lift the Bundesliga before he retires, and despite 29 shots and numerous chances, including a missed penalty, they just couldn't do it. But what hurts the most is how much genuine quality they can show for one portion of the game before completely falling apart later on. A prime example of this being the recent game this season against Real. They were absolutely hammering the best squad in the world, outplaying them and comfortably up 2-0 at halftime, only to completely collapse in the second half, conceding 5 goals and losing 5-2. They've been collapsing in games like this for years, despite going through multiple entirely new sets of players. I think it's just unfortunately ingrained in the DNA of the club since Klopp has left. But usually they can offset this with their quality up front and a leader at the back like Mats Hummels, for example. But this season they've just simply been lackluster, and I'm sure some fans are worried. We've seen German clubs fall from grace before. Look at where Dortmund's biggest rivals Schalke are right now. I bet that some Dortmund fans are afraid of ending up in a similar situation. But it may interest you to know that Dortmund have been in an even worse spot than this exactly 10 years ago. By this point in 2014-15, in Klopp's final season, Dortmund were 1 position lower and 5 points lower than they are right now. Just a few games before that, they were actually dead last in the table. Yeah, and that was with this squad. I remember watching Dortmund back then, since they were one of the first teams I fell in love with, and being absolutely shocked at how badly they were doing. And at the time, everyone was freaking out way more than they are now. In the end, Dortmund ended up having a good run to finish off the season and finished in 7th place. So I think this season will end up about the same. with Dortmund qualifying for the Europa League but missing out on those Champions League spots to Bayern, Leverkusen, Frankfurt, Leipzig, and maybe Stuttgart if there are 5 spots. Looking into the future, I see this as a bit of a crossroads for Dortmund. I think if they don't take a bit more risks and sign higher quality players, or really build a project around one elite manager, I could see them continuing to slip down the table, especially as the likes of Leipzig and Leverkusen continue to rise and fill the slot of the team that challenges Bayern every year. Dortmund don't have Zorc anymore, pulling out absolutely incredible signings from thin air, so they're going to need to adapt. But I think they will. Dortmund have been pretty consistently one of the best run clubs for the past couple decades, and all things considered, I think they'll keep on qualifying for the Champions League and competing. But it's just a little bit disappointing when you consider that they could be at a way higher level. Maybe if the board had taken a bit more risks, they could have actually won a couple more titles. However, football is a funny game because let's say Aller did score this penalty and Adeyemi did score this goal against Real Madrid, we could be looking at this totally differently. But the fact that they choke in these big moments is really what separates them from other top teams. All in all, why are Dortmund so bad this season? I think they're just a bit lost and they need to regroup and really have a long think about their identity. Are they going to keep trying to sell young talents for profit and then buy players from mid-table Bundesliga sides? Or are they going to rethink their approach a bit? I'll always have a soft spot for Dortmund and I'd love to see them succeed, so I'm really hoping they can pull something together. Thanks for watching. Dortmund fans, let me know of anything I may have missed, and if you agree or disagree with my overall points. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe to Footballers for more videos like this one.